Peter, we have there's a very loud buzz. I'm not sure what that buzz is.
Would you like to use Anna's iPad that worked last week?
We're running this through a laptop.
I think it's this. I think it's the Zoom. But let me. It is the 3 o'clock syndicated national.
Yeah.
Let's try on mine.
Yes, Eric?
Yeah, I'm gonna knock the other Peter out. Yeah, this is much better. There's no buzz. Could you just switch over to that?
Let me just get him out of bed. You know what? It's this computer. Now, we did it this way last time. With books underneath.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I hear like a little you know what?
Could you click out of the other one, please?
Yeah.
Because that will fix the audio.
Glasses on.
I'm gonna put it right here, I think. Okay, why don't you get comfy, Peter, and let's get you at the right angle. How about now? Can you test the audio?
Yeah, how's that? It's much better.
Great.
Wonderful.
Then we'll just here. Let's move you a little bit to the center and here, so you're good. Great.
Okay. And you've switched off the other one, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, here we go, Peter. Ready?
Ready.
Hello, everybody. I'm sorry. I'm going to start again. Hello, everybody. It's always nice to have a. Hold on. Are we good? Can we stop, please, moving in the background? Good?
Yes.
Okay, here we go now. Hello, everybody. It's always nice to have a Nobel Prize winner on this show. We've had a number in the past, including recently Geoffrey Hinton just won the Nobel for physics. We've had my old friend Maria Ressa in the past, a free speech journalist. We've had Simon Johnson, the MIT economist, and the Princeton economist, Angus Deaton. They've all been on talking about how concerned they are about the world and how they use their expertise to make the world a better place. We have another Nobel Prize winner, this one from 2003, Peter Agre, who won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry in 2003. And Peter has a new book out. It's called Can Scientists Succeed? Where Politicians Fail. Peter is joining us today. Peter, is it a big deal to win the Nobel Prize? Should viewers and listeners trust Nobel Prize winners like yourself more than ordinary mortals?
Well, I think Nobel Prize winners get a lot of recognition, which may or may not be entirely deserved. It's something that's awarded to someone who changes the course of science, but that didn't necessarily do all of the work. I think the public respects it, and I think that's a good thing. But when the Nobel Prize winners start predicting what the stock market will do or who's going to win the World Series, they may be beyond their specialty.
Well, that's wise. I'm certainly not going to ask you who's going to win the World Series. Peter, how did it change your life? As I said, you won it in 2003, more than 20 years ago. Is it a big deal, or was it one of those things that you grimace, show up in Stockholm, and then go home and continue with your real life?
I think no one goes to Stockholm and returns home, and it's let off the obligation of sharing the information. It is a big deal, and I think justifiably, but I think it's also a big deal for science and for academics, because the public learns about this and they show great interest in the prizes and sometimes the individuals. I mean, Nobels were awarded for the discovery of insulin, discovery of penicillin. These are discoveries which have certainly changed the course of human history.
Everybody knows that the Nobel Prize now is increasingly political. In fact, the current American president seems shamelessly greedy for a Nobel Prize. So for better or worse, it's always involved with politics. What did your experience in winning the Nobel and having your life changed? What did it tell you about this intersection, if you like, between politics and science, which you write about in your new book?
Well, there's an immediate effect, and it's celebrated widely within the university. Within a couple of hours of the announcement, the university president came over to my department to greet me. I had no idea we were such close personal friends until that moment.
I hope you told him that as well.
Oh, he was genuine. He's wonderful. But I think this is something like winning a basketball championship or having an important event occur. It draws attention to the university and to science as a whole. It's usually something that is highly technical, but can be adapted to help people or the well-being of our planet.
You look as if you still have a good head of hair, Peter, but I'm guessing you've been tearing some of your hair out recently over perhaps some of the problems with the contemporary world. The title of your book is Can Scientists Succeed Where Politicians Fail? Where, in your view, are politicians failing? Are they failing unnaturally in the 2020s? Haven't they always failed? Or have politicians over the last 20 years since you won the Nobel, have they failed more frequently than they have in the past?
Well, politicians have a very, politicians have a very difficult job. And so the title is a bit glib. I think titles are to give a short preview of what's inside and attract the attention of the potential readers. But I think politicians have done some very wonderful things and some very stupid things. And they're oftentimes not well trained in the understanding of science. So by serving as advisors and being ready and available and understandable, scientists can help the politicians do the right thing.
Can you give me one example of something you're thinking about where politicians have done the right thing and one where they've done the really stupid thing? One that comes, examples that come to mind, perhaps when it comes to science policy?
Well, the nuclear accord with Iran in 2015 was, I think, an example of where scientists helped politicians do the right thing. If you recall, that 10 years ago, the fear was that Iran was going to be not only the sponsor of terrorism, they were going to create nuclear weapons and threaten their neighbors. And there was a lot of opposition. They were undergoing serious embargoes to weaken them and hopefully get them to change their course. But it came down to politicians negotiating with Iranian politicians, and it didn't do well. Secretary of State John Kerry was meeting with Javad Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister, and it was at a standstill. The negotiations then passed on to the second in line. In Iran, that was Ali Akbar Salehi, an Iranian citizen, head of their atomic energy agency, former university chancellor, and former foreign minister of Iran, so immense credentials. but he was a nuclear physicist who happened to earn his PhD at MIT. He lived in the United States for several years while he was a graduate student. He has two brothers who are here. One is a neurosurgeon in Chicago. The other is an engineer in Washington, D.C., and his niece is an eye doctor at Johns Hopkins. So Salehi insisted that the American side put up Ernest Moniz, the Secretary of Energy, who was a scientist but in a political office. But together, Moniz and Salehi had no trouble negotiating. They started by bringing presents for the grandchildren of the other interlocutor. This let them digress and share common ground, and they were able to negotiate a successful nuclear arrangement wherein the Iranians would stop enriching uranium as a source for potential weapons. They would be allowed to enrich a small amount so it could be used for medical needs and generation of electricity. It really was the scientists, Salehi and Moniz, that made the nuclear agreement possible. And things were looking very optimistic. And it wasn't just the US, it was the P5 plus one, England, France, EU, plus Russia. And it was the second, after the appeasement, the next election was won by Donald Trump, who took a very different view. He felt the negotiations were not strong enough. He wanted a tougher deal, as he referred to it. So we canceled the nuclear agreement and we're back to ground zero. So
I want to come to a negative model, the example of my question, which I asked earlier. But some of you might be listening to this and saying, well, this is all very well, but it's all very well for Iranian and American scientists from MIT or Johns Hopkins. They all went to grad school together. They all get on very well. But the real powers that be are the Donald Trumps or the Ayatollahs who run Iran. And they have very, very different interests, very different ways of negotiation. So ultimately, it doesn't really matter whether PhDs from MIT or Johns Hopkins or Harvard can talk to one another. The real issue here is politics. I'm not defending Trump, but he clearly has his own agenda. He has his view on Iran. He doesn't trust the regime. And so it doesn't really matter how many scientists you get in a room. There's not a possibility of agreement with the Iranian.
Well, most of the time, in my book, I refer to cases. It's not a comprehensive textbook. It's really a series of 5 histories of different regions where scientists were able to smooth things over and reduce tensions. They don't make national policy, but they can provide true understanding. Certainly, Donald Trump gets a lot of criticism, but other presidents have made mistakes as well, but they've rectified them. I think that the theme of the book is not that scientists should be making all of the decisions, but they should be making the information accessible. And it comes down to the people in power to choose to use that information.
I asked you earlier of an example where politicians have perhaps screwed up which would strengthen your argument. So the positive example you gave was the Iranian-American Accord on nuclear disarmament. What would be a negative example?
Well, I think the prolonged hostility between Cuba and the United States is an example of failed politics on both sides. Fidel Castro had many strong qualities which we didn't appreciate. He was a totalitarian dictator, and there were people who were displaced from Cuba that have never forgiven them for being forced away. But he did have a vision for science, and Cuban science has brought forth medicines and a lot of advances which the U.S. has been traditionally prevented from participating in. But it was during the Clinton administration where the relations softened, and then there was a setback with the George W. Bush administration, and Obama decided to actually visit Cuba, and they agreed to normalize relations. So it's the president that sets the agenda. But I think the scientists cooperating might have been helpful. And Obama himself, in his address to the Cuban people, reminded them of the partnerships that American scientists had had with Cuban scientists back in the 1900 when the Yellow Fever Commission established the cause of yellow fever and prevented it.
Yeah, it's an interesting example. I'm not sure if all Cuban exiles and critics of the Castro regime would agree, but it's a provocative argument, Peter. What's happened over the last 20, 25 years since you won the Nobel Prize to make the public more and more skeptical of scientists? Why don't we trust, or certainly many of us trust, science and scientists anymore? And this, of course, came to a climax during COVID and the public debates, if that's the right word, about Anthony Fauci and the credibility of the American scientific establishment, which some people, particularly I think Trump, seem to suggest was inevitably and unavoidably political.
I agree. It became politicized, and that's very unfortunate. I think, to be objective, those who would criticize President Trump often fail to recognize that there was a leadership role in establishing the vaccines. This warp speed was successful, and vaccines were developed in record time, and that was not the issue. It was the providing of advice that seemed to change in the public, I think, sense uncertainty. And there was no clear certainty how the pandemic was going to play out. Traditionally, these pandemics will devastate a population, and then they eventually recover and become resistant. And that happened, but the agreement on who should wear a mask, who should be at home, was not handled smoothly and could be, in retrospect, done better. But it was a very frightening time for all Americans. Everyone in the world was at risk of some dire consequences from COVID.
Peter, can we get involved in this debate without being political? There was an interesting New York Times piece from earlier this year. Science, politics, and anxiety mixed at a rally at a rally under Lincoln Memorial, and this was very much involved with a group called Stand Up for Science. But some of these groups have, for better or worse, seem to be unavoidably political. Can one get involved in the debate? Can one get involved in the debate, Peter, without being political?
Yes. When I was a child growing up in the 1950s, we were at loggerheads with the Soviet Union, and the race for space was an example where the Soviet Union and the United States were pursuing the same objective, and the Soviets scored first. They put the Sputnik satellite in orbit, and this caused a great concern throughout the United States that we will be technologically inferior to our adversary. And to their credit, the public supported both the Republicans, President Eisenhower, and the Democrats, and budgets were increased, agencies were created, NASA being one of them. And the massive outpouring of funds improve the teaching of mathematics and science in public schools. My own family, my father did a sabbatical at UC Berkeley, leaving our home in Minnesota for a year because the funds were made available. It was bipartisan. I think that could continue, but the politicization is damaging and regrettable.
But that bipartisan attitude to science, isn't that history? It may have existed during your father's time, or maybe for you earlier in your career, but these days it's simply not possible.
Well, certainly there is mixed viewing of the importance of nuclear power. When the atomic bombs were dropped on Japan, it ended the war, but at a huge cost of civilian life. And we're still debating that, although I think by and large it's not happened since then. And we have to prevent it from ever happening again. And that's probably shared by people all across the political spectrum.
So you are still hopeful. I mean, I'm not sure if you're really answering my question. I mean, it seems as if it's almost impossible these days to have any debate about science and international policy. This is an area where you have a great deal of expertise without being political. I mean, Trump, for better or worse, has attacked these international organizations, from the WHO to the World Bank. Can one stick clear of politics, Peter, realistically?
I think you raise an important point. We should concentrate on solving the problem and not fixing blame. The whole two-party notion has been questioned. As Bob Hope, who phrased it most clearly when he said, no one political party can fool all of the people all of the time. That's why we need two parties. So we're involved in this tennis match, and no one's willing to come to the net and shake hands.
Well, you might, but so if that's the case, if no one's coming to the net, if each party blames the other, and as you said, the Bob Hope joke is that you need two parties because they're both wrong. Then what's the hope? People maybe will read your book, learn your wisdom, but where's the real opportunity here? Where do we get scientists to succeed where politicians fail, and at the same time not politicize those scientists so that they come across like perhaps Anthony Fauci did as a little bit of a know-it-all, as someone who was lecturing down to the ordinary people?
Yeah, well, people have different styles. Anthony Fauci is a very interesting American who really devoted his entire career to the well-being of the infectious disease patients throughout the world. But he's from Brooklyn. He's feisty, and that rubbed off on some people the wrong way. But his intentions were always very clear.
Yeah, I don't want to. I mean, I like it personally. I admire and trust Anthony Fauci, but he clearly upset some people. And of course, on the other side, you have somebody like RFK Jr. now, who's running American Health. He has gone into battle in some ways with American doctors. You're an MD, particularly on the vaccine front. What do you make of RFK Jr.? Is he an example of breaching this divide, or is he just more evidence of all the problems?
Well, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has come out in favor of some environmental issues, and that's appreciated widely, but his view on the mechanisms of disease reflect a lack of fundamental understanding. I think that his appointment was viewed as dangerous by many individuals, and to make vaccines less accessible or even inaccessible is counterintuitive. I imagine the decision to include him in the cabinet had something to do with promises made by the candidates, but both sides will do that. I think when the catastrophe occurs, everybody will have their own viewpoint of they told us so. But measles was virtually absent from the Western Hemisphere, and now measles is returning without the response from the leadership.
What is, you said when catastrophe occurs, what kind of catastrophe are we flirting with when it comes to RFK Jr.'s policies?
Well, he's been the secretary for just a few months, but they've had basically a decimation of the Center for Disease Control. Senior personnel have been dismissed or quit out of frustration because they could not do their jobs properly. It's a shambles. The favorite target for criticism of the U.S. aid to USAID to provide relief and medical to big parts of Africa has been closed, and they're seeing an uptick in disease. There are problems that occur when bad decisions are made.
So do these people, whether it's RFK Jr. or even Donald Trump, do they have blood on their hands, Peter?
I think there probably are better ways of stating it, but they're certainly responsible for creating problems. That's not to say everything that they stand for is wrong. I realize that there are some individuals who would disagree with anything they decided.
Finally, what can we do? I mean, if you're not a scientist or a politician, should people have more trust in what scientists say? Should they be more wary of becoming skeptics or conspiracy theorists when it comes to vaccines or other issues?
Well, the trust in science, I think, is sometimes exaggerated. Gallup polls have routinely showed that most trusted professionals are nurses, followed by practicing medical doctors, and the least trusted are politicians. So I think there are issues that have made this more concerning to the public, but by and large, the American public has been supportive. Certainly the funds for the research have been more generous from the United States government under all of the administrations until the present than in the other members of the developed world.
Well, there you have it, from a Nobel Prize winner, 2003, they won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry, Peter Agre, MD. His new book, Can Scientists Succeed Where Politicians Fail? I hope you're right, Peter, that we're not on the brink of catastrophe, although I fear we might be. Thank you so much. And I hope this book will have some sort of impact in terms of making people perhaps trust scientists more and recognize that science can help fix some of the world's problems rather than deepen.
Thank you for your interest and your very probing questions. I think that's very worthwhile to